Hello, this is Miss McCauley, and this is going to be the first video about the properties of multiplication. Okay, this video picks up where you left off on the properties of addition, and it will start with the commutative property of multiplication. You can write down the examples and the notes as you go through this video with the robots, or you can wait and watch part 2 of the video and write it all down at that time. It's really up to you. If you write it down now, you could probably not watch part 2 video.
When you multiply numbers, the order will not change the result.
Go ahead and pause here for a second, and you should write this down. The commutative property of multiplication says that for any numbers, a times b, it's the same thing as b times a. That just means that you can write any numbers and change the order, and it will not change the result. It's the very same thing as addition. Okay, once you've written that down, go ahead and press play.
Excuse me, Mr. Two? Is there some sort of easy way that I can figure how many pictures can be displayed on 25 screens? And each shows 3 rows with 4 photos in each row?
How were you going to calculate the number of pictures, Eddie?
I was going to multiply 25 times the quantity 3 times 4. But there must be an easier way.
I think I see a way. Use the commutative property of multiplication to write 3 times 4 as 4 times 3. Then... Mr. Two, is there an associative property for multiplication?
Yes, there is. The way factors are grouped does not change the product.
So I can multiply 25 times 4 first. That's 100. And 100 times 3 equals 300.
Let's see if we get the same product when we multiply 25 times the quantity 4 times 3 on the calculator.
4 times 3 equals 12. And 25 times 12 is 300.
So, the way 25, 4, and 3 were grouped does not change the product. This is an example of the associative property of multiplication. The way the factors are grouped does not change the product.
Okay, this is another important thing that you should write down, the associative property of multiplication. It's very much the same as the associative property of addition, but it's just for multiplication. You can change the way anything is ordered or grouped, and it will not change the product. It's just like the associative property of addition. It's like if A and B and C were all partners on a project, but A and B were sitting together and C was sitting in another group. They still are all working on the project together. The next day, maybe A sits in the other group and B and C sit together. They're still all working on the same project, but they're just in a different order or a different seating arrangement. That's what the associative property means. Once you've written this down, go ahead and come back and press play.
Mr. Two, I know the identity property of multiplication.
Well, then please share it with us.
The product of 1 and any number is that number. For example, 5 times 1 equals 5, and 1 times 3 equals 3.
Outstanding!
Okay, this is the third property of multiplication that you should write down. It's the identity property of multiplication. And the identity property of multiplication says the product of 1 and any number is the same number. It's just like the identity property of addition, except instead of 0 added to any number equals the same number, this time it's 1 times any number equals the number. So 1, we also can call that the multiplicative identity. Okay, and I'll write that down when we take our notes. Go ahead and press play once you finish writing that.
Another property is the multiplicative property of 0.
Zio has a property named after him?
No. I said the multiplicative property of 0. The product of 0 and any number is 0.
Ha! I always thought Zio was a 0.
Hey! For example, 7 times 0 equals 0. and 0 times 9 equals 0. Any number times 0 equals 0.
Okay, that's another property that you should write down is the multiplicative property of 0, and that just says that 0 times any number is 0.
In problem 6 of your lesson notes, what property is shown?
Okay, hopefully you can look at this and see 12 times 35 equals 35 times 12. Go ahead and write this example down in your notes and then come back and see if you guessed right. Hopefully you will have said that this is the commutative property of multiplication.
If you multiply in different orders, you get the same result. That's the commutative property of multiplication.
Yes. In problem 7 of your lesson notes, name the property shown.
Okay, go ahead and in your notes write down the example 6 times 0 equals 0 and write down the property that you think this is. Come back as soon as you think you know.
If you multiply any number by 0, the product is 0. That's the multiplicative property of 0.
6 times nothing is nothing. Makes sense.
Nice work. In problem 8 of your lesson notes, what is this property?
Okay, go ahead and look at this problem and write it down in your notes. 7 times 6 times 5 equals the quantity 6 times 5 times 7. Look at it carefully and see if you can figure out what this is.
The order of the factors is switched. That's the commutative property of multiplication.
Well done.
Okay, how many of you thought that was associative just because it had parentheses? That's a common mistake that a lot of people make. But really, this is the commutative property because the 6 times 5 moved in front of the 7. But the numbers inside the parentheses, 6 times 5, stayed the same. So that's why it's the commutative property of multiplication.
In problem 9 of your lesson notes, name the property shown.
Okay, go ahead and write this example down. 3 times the quantity, 2 times 8, equals the quantity of 3 times 2 times 8. Come back when you think you know the answer. Press pause now. Hopefully you have said,
The products are equal even though the factors are grouped differently. That's the associative property of multiplication.
Very good. What property is shown in problem 10 of your lesson notes?
okay, go ahead and write this down. In your notes, 7 times 1 equals 7. Hopefully you know this pretty easily, and then come back and press play once you think you have the answer.
If you multiply any number by 1, the product is that number. That's the identity property of multiplication.
A fine job.
Let's use these properties.
Okay, we're actually going to stop here for a second, and now I'm going to go into GoodNotes and make sure you have all of these properties written down, and then we will learn one last property, the distributive property. Go ahead and go to your GoodNotes, and let's write down the commutative property of multiplication. Hopefully you already have it, but I'll go ahead and write it as well. This just says A times B equals B times A. Okay, that means you can change the order and not change the product. Change the order of the factors and not change the product. Hopefully you have written some examples as well from the video. Okay, go ahead and go to your next page. Okay, the next one is the associative property of multiplication. Very same as the associative property of addition, except with multiplication. This just says that A times the quantity of B times C equals the quantity of A times B times C. You can change the grouping. Change the grouping. Remember, associate means group. Okay, I'm going to actually write that up here. Group. Groups. Change the groupings of the factors without changing the product. Without changing the product. Okay, and go ahead and go to your next page. The multiplicative identity property. First of all, let's write down the multiplicative identity, because sometimes you will hear it phrased that way. If someone says, what is the multiplicative identity? That means the number 1. It is the multiplicative identity, and all it means is A times 1 equals A for any number. Any number times 1. Any number times 1 equals the same number. That's why it's called the multiplicative identity. Okay, now the multiplicative property of 0. That is, this property says that A, for any number, A could be any number, A times 0 equals 0. Okay, so any number in the whole world, any number times 0 equals 0. Always true. Okay? Please answer this question and show your teacher your answer at the end of part 1, and then move on to part 2 of the lesson video for the multiplication properties.